Hi, hello everybody, and welcome to WOA's latest online webinar. Today our subject is going to be looking at digitization to reduce trade and invoice fraud in a post-COVID world. I'm John Bressist and I'll be moderating today's session. Fraud is a constant in the open account industry, has been, probably always will be, but particularly as we see ourselves coming out of the ravages of the COVID pandemic, we're probably going to see it as a particular issue because people will take advantage of it. So I'm delighted to welcome three speakers today to come and join and discuss the issues that are around this. We've got Margaret Lucia Emenega, Raj Uttamchandani and Brad Lucas, all from Trade Finance Market, and who together are going to talk and explore around the issues that need to be considered in this arena. And they're also going to share with you their thoughts about how this might be dealt with and give an example of a demonstration of their particular product solution. And at the end of the session, at the end of our webinar, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So please use the question and answer button that you see on your screen, and we'll address it at the end of the session. We're going to run between 45 minutes and a maximum of an hour today. So looking forward to having plenty of opportunity to discuss the concerns that might be raised about looking at fraud. I think what I'll do then is, if I may, I will pass over to Margaret. Margaret Lucia-Emenega, I have known for many years. Margaret and I go back a long time. Margaret was previously an MD at West LB. She was the CEO of Finback in Malta. She's been the chair of IFG. She had her own consultancy business, Quarterback, and many other positions of responsibility. So Margaret, if I may, I'll pass the baton over to you, and perhaps you'd like to introduce in a bit more detail Raj and Brad.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity to present to you the digitalization opportunity that trade finance market can offer. We obviously see the fraud issues in open account business as one of the biggest, most critical to tackle. And I'm very pleased to be together with Raj and Brad, who have found, in my opinion, a very interesting and appealing solution to solve some of these problems, but only if the market and the industry embraces it. So we hope by this webinar, we can motivate you, because you're very important to this market as WOA members and some of your clients, to join these efforts to make our business better and safer. So I would like to give the word to Raj, who is the co-founder, executive director of Trade Finance Markets, and who will introduce you briefly to the ideas and the solutions. And then, of course, Brad Lucas, our IT specialist, will walk you through the application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marguerite, and thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon together with to talk about how digitization can reduce fraud in a post-COVID world. Last year definitely brought in a lot of changes to the industry and the way of working. And what we've seen in the market is that there's a very extreme push now to figure out how to use digitization as a normal part of business activities. Whereas previously digitization was seen as a nice to have, we found that the events of last year has accelerated that requirement, particularly by funders and all parties who are part of the trade and invoice finance world. As Marguerite mentioned, we've been working on this solution primarily to see how we can help the industry to reduce fraud, but also to see how SMEs can benefit from increased liquidity, which is extremely needed in today's world. About the big idea behind digitization and how it impacts fraud. So in today's world, the demand for trade finance and invoice factoring is high. Demand by SMEs for liquidity to face events caused by last year's pandemic has even accelerated this demand even further. However, as we've all seen, recent news events, various companies, so is the risk of fraud, particularly via documentation, invoices, warehouse receipts, BLs, etc. So there's a greater requirement from financial institutions now to reduce fraud, and adoption of digital tools is seen as the new normal. It's a necessary facility that's being requested. In a time of market stress and reduced liquidity, digitization drives confidence. We've seen that all around. Potential solutions include blockchain applications that can anonymously identify and store transactions. And later in this presentation, we'll do a live demonstration of such an application that solves this problem. So let's go a little bit into the problem in detail. Paper-based documents are to high-value fraud. A funder has no way of knowing if an invoice has already been financed, and this leads to defaults and higher costs. So in our business, when we get an invoice, particularly from a jurisdiction which doesn't do any electronic invoicing, it's very difficult to actually understand what that invoice represents. At the point of receipt, it's either a piece of paper, a scan, a PDF document, essentially a piece of paper with some bits of ink on it. What does that actually represent? And this ambiguity opens up a window of fraud. Invoices can be presented to multiple funders and fintech platforms. The same invoice can then be funded multiple times. And we've seen this in a number of jurisdictions. Some of them have been well publicized, some haven't, but this is a very common occurrence. The chain of title is difficult to establish. Funders can't share data directly with each other due to data protection, as well as regulatory issues. So this is actually a big problem. Bank A can't exchange data directly with Bank B due to GDPR, customer confidentiality, data protection, regulatory issues. And this leaves a window of opportunity open up for fraud. The lack of central registries and non-standard approaches to invoicing mean that this is a challenge to address. So let's look at potential solutions and the positives and negatives of each one. So the first one is very obvious, central registries. So these are registries proposed and run by governments, but they come with a number of caveats. The main driver for these registries is primarily to collect tax, VAT, and so on, as opposed to reduction of fraud. Secondly, do financial competitors really want to share their intentions and activities in a public registry? The registry can be hacked, data can leak, and we've seen this occur in a number of jurisdictions. And to generate the invoices, multiple systems are used. So this leads to non-standardization and the ability to actually edit invoices before they're put onto the central registry. The next potential solution is scanning documents. So getting a PDF of an invoice may seem like a fairly reasonable solution, but you then have to ask who scanned the document. Was it a true original? Was it a digitized file? How has the file been altered? And you also need to understand who the originator of the invoice is. So for example, they would need to be the person to create a digital file to allow verification. So scanning documents needs to have a lot of other bits and pieces running parallel to it to fully emerge as a solution which reduces or eliminates fraud. If we look at databases that actually store all this information, multiple documents can be generated once it's on a database. Is the document really the invoice, or is it just a scan that represents something else that has been altered? So what we actually need to look at is not a facsimile or representation of the invoice, but the actual data bits that are used to create the document. And we also need to verify that it's a true invoice. So how do we do that? Essentially, what we need is a trusted middleman, a system where financial parties anonymously check on the status of a document and anonymously register a lien, for example, if they financed an invoice. A middleman can work, but can be compromised by systems or people. So we've seen these in a number of different spheres where systems have been hacked, data has been breached, or somebody from inside the organization has just taken a USB drive and copied all the information and then just gone and leaked it on the internet. So the issue of trust is paramount here. So we come on to the blockchain. The blockchain represents quite an interesting evolution in technology, which could potentially replace the middleman. And the reason that it could do that is that funders submit their question to an invoices state anonymously. The system then returns a yes or no to the question as to whether it recognizes the invoice, for example, or whether it's been financed. A funder would then do their status to funding and would also register their lien on an invoice. The system would then save the data in a state which is write once, read many times. It's very interesting to note that blockchain technology has only been around for about 5 years, 5 or 6 years. Bitcoin has obviously been around for longer than that, but the commercialization of blockchain technology has only been around for a short period of time. But the applications for blockchain to solve this trusted middleman problem is very, very apparent. We believe it's actually the true use case of blockchain technology in this regard. So Invoice Check is actually an example that we've built to actually help us in determining whether an invoice has been financed before. The way that it works is that it indicates if an invoice has been financed by enabling the cooperation between parties who don't know each other and who can't trust each other and exchange data directly with each other. But the system provides chain of title and an audit trail of all transactions. And these are all encrypted on the blockchain. Again, this is very important because data is secure once it's on an encrypted state on the blockchain. No single entity owns the database. So this minimizes the chances of hacking and of data breach. And if the data is breached and leaked, it really doesn't signify anything. And Brad will actually show you how this all works in the demo. Again, the blockchain is tamper resistant. It's beyond the influence of the contract's participants. So no one single entity can hack into the system and then change the contents. Again, this is another advantage when compared to a central registry where everything is in one place and can be compromised. Another important factor is that data is protected from potential competitors. This paramount importance when having a client-facing system and also ensuring them that the data is tamper resistant. So if we look at the overall system, this is how it would operate. You've got the system users on the left, which are the fintechs, the credit insurers, the banks and the factors and the shipping companies, all submitting data either via a UI form or more likely via an API, which plugs into existing systems and existing workflows. The data is then pushed into Invoice Check, and then it runs on an Ethereum node with a smart contract. Essentially, what we're doing is we're building the internet of invoices, and this can also be applied to bills of lading. We've also deployed it for warehouse receipts. Again, similar concept. But this is an example of how the blockchain could be used to solve this problem. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Brad, who's our CTO. Brad has over 2 decades experience building systems for Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Fidelity, and is the architect of the Invoice Check application. And we're going to show an example of how fraud can be reduced via digitization using the blockchain. So it's over to you, Brad.
Thank you, Raj. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen here. And I'll pick up where Raj's last image was here. So to introduce Invoice Check from a technology side, it's important to kind of start with the fact that there are 2 interfaces to the system. The first is what we'll call the UI form, and this is for anyone to use manually. And then there's the API, which will allow programmatic access to the system. And that's the ultimate goal for any large firm who is processing lots of invoices. Overall, the system will be a success when more and more firms are using it. So to help get to that point, we've made it as simple as possible to use. So the integration costs are they're very low because it's really quite straightforward. Before I show the system, I'm just going to show a brief introduction to an invoice. And if we look at an invoice, there's an awful lot of data on here, but there's only 6 fields that are the most important, and they are the 2 parties involved, the invoice identifier or invoice number, the date, the amount, and the currency. So what we've done is we're taking those 6 fields and making them the fields that Invoice Check needs to identify an invoice. If we go back to what Raj was talking about with scanned documents and other formats of identifying invoices, there's too much room for error as to whether or not you have the right information. And if you have these 6 fields, they are the most important. So if you use those fields for our system, you will always have the same invoice. So what we're really trying to get at is identifying an invoice is most important, and agreeing on an invoice from 2 different parties. And remember how you're introduced to the idea that there's a middleman, and Invoice Check is the middleman. Each party is going to submit these 6 fields, and they're going to be reduced to a common identifier inside the system. And both parties will get an answer back as to the stated invoice. And for the factors of our discussion, stamping an invoice is funding an invoice. So Invoice Check allows you to check to see if an invoice has been previously stamped. So all parties will check by submitting the information they have for an invoice, and they'll get back a true, false, a yes, no. To start, I'll show you an Invoice Check, which has 2 components, company and invoice. And one aspect is you have to look up your companies ahead of time, and you're going to do that with common third-party identifiers. And this way, the system will always agree on what companies are involved in the invoice. Right now, I'll show you the one for the example. I mean, simple. For Singapore, for example, you need an ROC number, and once you have that, you come back here, you submit it, and you're allowed to select it. And once you've selected your your companies, when you go to enter an invoice, you just pick them from your list. And keep in mind, this is for users. You can do this all programmatically with the API, which I'll show you after this. Let me show you entering an invoice. We use the same two parties, and we'll make up some data. And we'll on February 1st, and we'll do 10,000. 10,000. What happens now is those 6 fields are condensed down into what we'll call a fingerprint. And this fingerprint is the unique identifier that we've generated for this invoice. If any other user or party using the system enters these same fields, they'll get back to the same fingerprint. And then this fingerprint is associated with a state. And at the moment, the invoice is not stamped. And if you are interested in funding this and you wanted to fund it, you would stamp it. And then any other party using the system would get back a stamped true. So I have one party who's entered this invoice. I can go over and I can log in as someone else, and I can do the same thing over, and I can actually show how the stamping works. So to do that, I'll just log out really quickly, and I'll log in again. And over here, I'm going to submit the same information, and I'm under a different account. And I'll enter this in and get back the same ID. Now, if I stamp it, what happens? It says that it's stamped. And what's happened internally is the value of the fingerprint has now been written to the blockchain and has been written stamped. And because the smart contract is set up in such a way that you can only write once and read many times, now this invoice has been marked as funded for now and forever. So now if I go back and I go back to the original account and I log in, I can actually check my invoice because I've already done it once. And let me see if I can scroll over here. I'll notice that it has been stamped. The system, because we're using the user interface, the system has actually gone and checked it for you. If I had not submitted the invoice before and I went and checked it, it would tell me the same thing, that it would be stamped. The API is modeled on the same set of data. It does the exact same thing, and it is done in such a way that if you use the interface, you'll understand how the API works. The documentation here shows you that all you need to do is come up with these data fields. And anybody who's running a system that has companies and invoices will be able to figure this out quite quickly. You will already have your identifiers for your companies. You will already have an identifier for the invoice. You'll have the date, value, and currency. All you need to do is package it up and call the API as part of your, evaluation in the invoice, and whether just before you fund an invoice, you want to check it. I go back up here. I can show you how this works in practice with this interface, which is called Swagger, which is just a layer that lets me show you how the API is working as if I was the program. To do that, you need your token, which I'm going to cut and paste it from my account. It looks like is, one second. So every account, when they log in, gets a token, and the token is what you need to run the API. This is pretty standard. And then we need to build up our data structure. This is obviously you're not going to type this in yourself. Your program will do this. And what your program will do, it'll grab the ID. This ID is the one that we looked up earlier, but you will have already stored this in your system. And then we're going to add in our information. Here, I did 10,000. So when I submit this, I will get back a bunch of information. But the most important thing is we got back our ID, which is the fingerprint. And we also see that it's been stamped true. So if you remember, the second party stamped the invoice, and here we're back using the first user's token. And so now we're seeing that it is stamped. So in a workflow, this would tell you right away that you don't want to have anything to do with this invoice from a funding standpoint. Just to show you the rest of the API quickly here, we have ways to figure out what country codes to use and how to identify them. We have a way to look up the companies. So obviously you're not going to be manually looking these all up. And then the 3 methods of the invoice. The first was what we just saw. This is checking or submitting. And then there's a way to check it once you have your fingerprint. You can do this anytime you want. You're just adding your token and that fingerprint ID. And then the last one is the stamping. This is the final step if you're going to be wanting to mark the invoice as being stamped. Another thing to keep in mind here is there's no storing of any data. The only data that is getting stored is that fingerprint and the state on the blockchain. So users are anonymous. They're just entering the data and getting a value back. And there's no way to know who checked it, who stamped it. It's just the fact that it is stamped or it isn't stamped. To follow up with this, I'll just show you, quickly. This is a Python script that can check an invoice or submit it. And this is one to show you how you can stamp it. As you can see, there's very, very little to it. So from an integration standpoint, this is very simple. From a database standpoint, you're not going to have to add very much. You're going to already have your identifiers for your companies and your invoices, and all you're going to have to store is the fingerprint and whether or not it's stamped. So, let your system know that you're not going to deal with the invoice. And lastly, I'll show you a log of the blockchain, and this is showing the private chain running. And in the middle here, you'll see the periodic submissions to write the status of the invoice to the chain. Hopefully that was clear enough. And later we'll have some questions and answer period, and I can go through any parts of this that were not clear.
Thank you very much, Brad. I think that's very useful in terms of a demo, because what we've actually shown is that any system that is developed today has the ability to work with existing workflows. There's no need to revamp existing systems and processes at huge cost in order to get this thing working. So I think that's a huge win, and that comes via the benefit of working with APIs, which we think are going to be much more prevalent moving forward in terms of a task that needs to be done to reduce fraud, pinging the API, coming back with a result, and continuing with the workflow. The other point that I wanted to stress is, although we talk about fraud, and that is usually linked with the amount on an invoice or double financing of an invoice, actually identifying the parties that are transacting is key in all of this. And again, by virtue of today's technology and governments now moving towards more sort of open APIs and open data, we're able to actually access the government registries in places like Singapore and the UK, which are quite a way bit ahead in terms of allowing access to this. So identifying parties is not much of a problem as it was, say, maybe even a year or two ago. So we think that in today's environment, there is definitely the way in terms of technology to reduce any type of fraud, whether it's invoice fraud, warehouse receipt fraud, and so on. And that exists. So the technology is not a problem. I think where what needs to happen next is to have widespread adoption of the APIs and understanding that we're actually going to move forward and embrace digitization and make this an active part of our workflows moving forward.
We have just a question from one of the panelists, from one of the audience, and it meets exactly what you're addressing. He's asking how can one join? What are the requirements? So maybe that would be a timely answer to the questions from our audience.
Yeah, so thank you very much for highlighting that, Marguerite. And got a question from Marius. So it's very easy to join the system. It's all API based. I'm going to hand over to Brad to explain a little bit more about how to practically join for all members of WOA and anyone listening on this webinar.
Sure. I think right off the bat, we should just give out an email address as team@tradefinancemarket.com as a way to make sure you can contact us with your interests, especially going forward. What we're doing is we're going to release a sandbox version of Invoice Check for Singapore. And we're going to do that over the weekend. And then after that, we're going to have ones for different countries moving forward. And if everybody gave us, if you have specific countries in mind, definitely let us know. And so once the Singapore version's out, send us an email or send us one sooner rather than later. And we'll send you a pointer to the site. And all you'll have to do is click on the registration button, sign up, just going to be name, email, password. And then you can go try it out. And it should be pretty easy to figure out. You can test it. You can do exactly what I just did in the demo. You can add an invoice that you have and double check it. If you have multiple users in your organization, set up a second account and, verify that once you stamp one, that somebody else can check it. And basically keep us in the loop on how things work. And, if you have any issues or you want to, give us suggestions or you have trouble integrating it, definitely give it back to me on that. I can more than happy to help you out as far as helping with any scripts or system integration work.
Great. Thank you, Brad.
I have a bit of a question as well, or maybe just for the audience to confirm. The platform can handle both and domestic as international business. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. So as Brad mentioned, we're opening up the platform to Singapore, first of all. But the idea is to handle both domestic and cross-border side of the transactions. So the key is actually just getting the data into the system, and we've identified ways that data is currently invoice data is currently being handled. And I think that by actually doing it in a way that is much more sort of systemized and API driven, that actually opens itself up to doing almost any kind of invoice or any kind of document globally. So it can definitely be used for domestic and cross-border factoring, for sure.
Thank you. The other question, which is a little bit in my mind, which I guess is also in the audience's mind, is we see developments of registers in the countries, as you mentioned earlier. Will the platform be able to connect with them? Is that something which is in the pipeline or will be possible? I know the country government registers will be slow to develop, but still it will be something which eventually will be there and therefore would be useful to apply into the platform if possible as well.
No, absolutely.
Sure.
And sorry,
Sure.
Brad, do you want to take this?
Sure. So yeah, we will integrate with country registries, and what we'll do is we'll take on the integration when they become available to translate what each country comes up with as far as their invoice ID. And when we have that done, Invoice Check will just be even easier to use. So right now, the identification of the invoice data, still requires a little bit of, looking up the company ID, making sure you have the right fields. Once you have a registry, those fields will come from the registrar system, and we will take those and do exactly what we're doing now. So there should be no worry with those. Also, there's no need to really wait for them. And, when they do happen, we'll know about it, and we'll be integrated with them by the time they're done. I'm sure that they'll take a lot longer to get their thing running before it takes for us to integrate with them.
Yes, no, we are aware that government initiatives will be long-term, but still, it's good to know. We have another questions from the audience, which says, how much should one pay to use the solution? Maybe Raj can take this one for us.
Sure, with pleasure. Obviously, this is a very important topic, and everybody wants to know what the cost is. So we at TFM have actually built this system in order to benefit the industry as a whole. We recognize that the issue of fraud and double financing is a huge one, but we also recognize that in order for it to work effectively, we need network effects, i.e. people need to start using it. So as TFM, we decided that the industry needs a solution like this, so we decided to build it. And we're offering it at no cost, members and attendees. And then once we get to a situation where we see that, for example, if we're handling hundreds of millions of invoices a day, then obviously that overhead needs to be looked after. And then we'll come back to the users and say, well, this is the cost that's going to be needed in order to pay for the infrastructure. And we'll come up with pricing that makes sense for everybody. But for right now, we're doing this as a public good for the industry in the hope that it actually benefits funders to avoid the losses and the situations that developed last year, but more importantly, to help SMEs reach the liquidity that they need, especially after business took a severe downturn in 2020. And as I said, we're releasing it. So as Brad mentioned, anybody who wants to join, send us an email. We'll be happy to put you on the system.
Okay, I think if we have no more questions, and maybe we can summarize briefly what we try to bring across, that blockchain technology can really help to reduce fraud in our very challenging environments. It is essential that open account financing is made more available to the industry, especially the SMEs, but also is more capable of finding funders and reduce the risks for funders. Because if the funders feel they can operate more safely, they will be more willing to fund, and maybe also pricing will be a little bit better for the industry, because SMEs struggle and not only to find funding, but also with very excessive pricing in some areas. So from my point of view, it is absolutely critical that we find the industry to embrace and to take this potential solution, and I think very useful mitigator of risks, to embrace this and take it with us forward, hopefully for a better environment for all stakeholders. Maybe Raj, you want to close the webinar briefly for us?
Sure. I think you've given an excellent summary of the benefits of digitization, Marguerite. And I think that it's now up to the industry participants to embrace the avenues of utility and actually jump in and seize the benefits of digitization. As I previously mentioned, the technology is here. What needs is the willingness of the industry to say that we're going to proceed and move ahead in order for this to happen. And I think that it's always useful to preempt the next crisis by putting in systems in place in order to minimize any sort of loss for funders, but also loss of business for SMEs. This system also provides security to enable funders to consider clients they may not normally have looked at in the past. So there's a lot of benefits and a lot of good that comes from technology when applied to the invoice and trade finance sector. And digitization, we believe, has just started. And we look forward to seeing how this journey progresses over the next few years. So I wanted to also take this opportunity to thank WOA, Eric and John, for putting this webinar together, and also for all the attendees who've taken some time off today in order to join us. I hope that it's been useful for all of you. And if you have any questions or would like to participate, please send us an email to team trade for any questions. And also, if you wanted to set up a test account for this, happy to do so. Brad, I don't know if you want to add anything to it.
Not much. Just want to thank everybody, and again, invite everybody to contact us at team@tradefinancemarket.com. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Margaret, Raj, and Brad for that, and a very interesting presentation, which much appreciated. I think fraud is clearly a matter which is of great interest and concern to everybody in WOA, not only because of the direct losses that it can cause, but also the loss of business it causes through risk aversion in subsequent times for the affected companies. So I think anything that we can see, anything we can explore and look at to see ways of trying to make the fraudsters locked a more difficult one, to make the world of business, the world of open account more secure, has to be beneficial. So with that, thank you to our presenters and thank you to our audience. We look forward to you joining us for our next World of Open Account webinars. Please take a look at our website and you'll see the series that we have for you. So thank you very much, everybody, and a very good afternoon to you. Thank you.